France and Germany both end up operating under the same European Union rulebook, the markets in crypto asset regulation. So at first glance, you might ask, why compare them at all? The route to that European framework shaped what adoption meant in practice, what was regulated first, which authorities led, how quickly supervision tightened, and how much space was left for innovation under oversight. A shared destination does not erase the policy journey, and it does not eliminate national differences in regulatory style and enforcement culture. In this episode, I will do three things. I will walk you through the chronology year by year, showing what France and Germany did, who acted, and which regulatory tools they used. I will compare the tone and language each system used. I will explain why this comparison still matters now that the European framework is in place. When governments face a new technology, they tend to repeat the same four types of activity: strategic processes, consultative processes, deliberative processes of evaluation. Now in 2024, France communicates priorities and cross-border supervisory posture, while Germany communicates the legal operational mechanisms that structure market entry and ongoing compliance. France's language visibly shifts from distancing to design and legitimization, to transition management and mature supervision. Germany's language is more consistently technical, becoming increasingly detailed as the system moves from classification to authorization, to infrastructure, and then to European rulebook implementation. Well, not really, because MiCA harmonizes the legal endpoint, not the way each system arrived there. Do you think a single European Union rulebook will gradually standardize supervisory practice, or will national regulatory styles continue to shape how compliance is experienced? France and Germany both end up operating under the same European Union rulebook, the markets in crypto asset regulation. So at first glance, you might ask, why compare them at all? The reason is simple. The route to that European framework shaped what adoption meant in practice, what was regulated first, which authorities led, how quickly supervision tightened, and how much space was left for innovation under oversight. A shared destination does not erase the policy journey that shaped its market beforehand, and it does not eliminate national differences in regulatory style and enforcement culture. So, in this episode, I will do three things. First, I will walk you through the chronology year by year, showing what France and Germany did, who acted, and which regulatory tools they used. Second, I will compare the tone and language each system used as crypto moved from uncertain status to structured governance. Third, I will explain why this comparison still matters now that the European framework is in place. I have already covered MiCA, by the way, in a separate episode. You can watch it. So here the focus is not on repeating the rulebook, no, but on understanding how different national pathways shape the market and can still shape how supervision and compliance feel in practice. Welcome back to By the Rules. And now, let us begin. To keep this comparison clear, I'm going to use a simple policy process lens. So this is based on theory, but in practice as well. So when governments face a new technology, they tend to repeat the same four types of activity. The order is rarely neat, but the pattern is remarkably consistent. The key question is not only what rules appear, but how they come into being and who shapes them along the way. So first, we have the strategic processes. So this is about direction and ownership, who takes the lead, what objectives dominate, and how the balance is framed between innovation, investor protection, and anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist financing and financial stability. In practical terms, who is from that country in the driving seat? Finance, ministry, market regulator, central bank, or prudential supervision, and how and what does that choice tell us about the country's priorities? Second, are the consultative processes. This is about who gets to speak before rules harden. So here, In a country level, we think about the public warnings, speeches, guidance papers, calls for evidence and consultations. These processes are presented as open and transparent, but a critical question here is whose voice is realistically heard? Okay? Are smaller innovators, consumers, and civil society genuinely shaping the conversation? Or do well-researched incumbents and specialist intermediaries dominate the inputs? Third, we have the deliberative processes. So this is where institutions translate board principles into concrete governance. We have legal context, authorization thresholds, licensing conditions, disclosure duties, supervisory expectations, and enforcement tools. So this is the stage where slogans like innovation friendly but safe not being rhetoric and become operational requirements that firms must meet. And the final stage, we have the processes of evaluation. This is close to the loop, okay? So authorities react to market developments, failures, enforcement cases, and cross-border risks, and they decide what to tighten, what loopholes to close, and what to redesign as the market evolves. So the practical question here is what counts as evidence of success or failure, and how quickly do authorities adapt when reality diverges from initial expectations? So using this lens helps explain why France and Germany can share the same European Union endpoint, yet still show different sequencing, different regulatory signals, and different adoption dynamics and practice. Let's look at both of them like year by year. In 2017, we have France. France's documented trajectory begins with a very clear boundary setting moment. The IMF, together with the ACPR, issues public warnings to investors during a period of heightened attention to crypto assets. The signal is protective and distancing. Crypto is treated as high risk and not yet comfortable situated within familiar legal categories or ordinary supervisory expectations. 2018, we have France. In France, the posture shifts from warning to design. So the IMF produces analytical and consultative work focused on ICOs, trading token fundraising as a governance problem rather than only a consumer risk issue. It begins outlining structured pathways for how token activity could be managed under supervision, while also using more technical legal reasoning to clarify when certain crypto-linked products may fall under existing financial rules, depending on their structure. Now in Germany, the starting instinct is a little bit different. The starting point is a little bit different, with BaFin framing crypto assets through a technology-neutral risk equivalence logic, often expressed as same risk, same regulation. The tone remains cautious, but the method is classification. Crypto is approached as an activity to be mapped into existing legal categories, rather than as something requiring a separate regulatory route from outset. Now, in 2019, France moves from experimentation to institutional anchoring. So we have the Pacte era approach, where the construction of a structured national framework for token activity and for digital asset service providers alongside clear signals from the IMF leadership, basically, which says that national action must connect to European coordination because crypto markets are inherently cross-border. Now, Germany, by contrast, deepens legal operational clarity rather than creating a bespoke crypto framework narrative. So BaFin clarifies how token offerings can trigger prospectus and authorization requirements. Depending on classification, and the compliance dimension becomes more explicit. The governance framing is not only about investor protection, it embeds the anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist financing logic as central component of how crypto adoption must be controlled. Germany's central bank discourse through Bundesbank basically places crypto developments within broader questions of payments, stability, and monetary governance. Now let's look in 2020. France's approach becomes more procedural and more explicitly EU-oriented. The IMF engages with the EU-level digital finance debates, supporting approaches that distinguish between crypto assets that qualify as financial instruments and those that require a specific regime. And it continues operating in the national framework in a way that anticipates harmonization. Now, Germany in 2020 becomes a decisive supervised entry anchor year. So basically, BaFin formalizes the supervisory perimeter around key activities, most notably it was the crypto custody, through authorization, focused guidance, and transitional arrangements for firms moving into the regulated space. So the language is administrative and conditions-based. Entry requirements, governance expectation, internal controls, and compliance obligations become the dominant register. In 2021, France. So the story basically is reinvent and operational enforceability. So the IMF clarifies supervisory scope and adjusts rules and policies. So basically the framework is more workable in practice. While in Germany, the trajectory broadens beyond crypto markets into legally recognized tokenization infrastructure. So electronic securities and crypto securities recorded in a supervised register framework. This is an important governance signal because tokenization is not simply tolerated but enabled inside securities law while remaining under formal oversight. So in comparative terms, France is improving a national supervisory toolkit. So Germany is embedding tokenization into market infrastructure design. In 2022, France positions EU harmonization as the clear destination. So the narrative strongly supports the markets in crypto assets regulation as the step needed for confidence, market integrity, and reduced regulatory arbitrage, alongside support for EU mechanisms intended to enable innovation while preserving safeguards. So Germany in 2022 becomes more granular and perimeter expanded to detailed compliance controls. Compliance becomes important here, okay? Particularly transfer-related due diligence expectations, and it brings the DeFi into focus as a governance challenge. Innovation potential is acknowledged, but risks to consumers and market order are foregranted with the view that regulation may be needed if DeFi grows in scale and competes with traditional markets. Now, in 2023, France's year is dominated by transition management. So the IMF communicates the direction of travel toward implementation of the markets and crypto asset regulation and prepares for the shift from national arrangements to EU-level mechanisms. At the same time, France engages in forward agenda setting through a DeFi discussion paper approach, signaling that the markets and crypto asset regulation does not close the governance debate for decentralized systems. Germany, on the other side, maintains a consistent style of perimeter management through classification and case-by-case treatment. BaFin reiterates supervised activities and extends the same classification force logic to emerging forms. For example, the NFTs that emphasize that a regulatory treatment depends on function, legal qualification, and associated risk. Now, in 2024, in both countries, the discussion is not about what the regime it should be. It's more about how will the European Union regime apply in practice. In France, the emphasis is in operational readiness and transition steps, reflecting that the markets and crypto asset regulation applies in stages, with key provisions taking effect during 2024 and the broader framework applying from late 24 into early 25. In Germany, the 24 materials concrete supervisory instruments, cross-border supervisory engagement. We have audit and reporting expectations that capture crypto asset activity and high-level emphasis on risk equivalent treatment, alongside preparation for the European Union framework authorization and disclosure requirements. Now let's move in 2025, where France presents a mature supervision posture, with the IMF setting the supervisory priorities with a strong cross-border emphasis and integrates the EU-level expectation into how supervision is framed, including restrictive measures related expectations reinforced with restrictive measures related expectations. Germany's 2025 story is dominated by the operational mechanisms of the EU framework. The narrative highlights issuer obligations and disclosures, token categories including the arts and ends, authorization and transition pathways for CASPs, and supervisory allocation. So BaFin in cooperation with the Bundesbank with the EU levels roles for certain categories as described. And then we have, by this stage, both countries treat crypto as a regulated sector at scale, but their institutional emphasis remain visible. France communicates priorities and cross-border supervisory posture, while Germany communicates the legal operational mechanisms that structure market entry and ongoing compliance. If you want to understand how France and Germany treated the adoption, do not only track what they did, but track how they spoke while doing it. What did regulators choose to emphasize at each stage? Uncertainty, risk, governance, design, or enforcement? And when they use terms like innovation or protection, what did those words actually translate into their communications and instruments? So in France, the early tone is clearly cautionary. In 2017, when the IMF and ACPR issue public warnings, the language is protective and distancing. What is the core message? That crypto is basically risky and that it does not sit comfortably within familiar legal categories or ordinary supervisory expectations. But from 2018, the French register starts to shift. Instead of only warning, the IMF begins treating issues as something that needs to be structured. What does that imply? That the question is no longer how do we keep people away, but how do we channel this activity into a governable route. The vocabulary becomes more institutional and design-oriented analysis, consultation, frameworks, pathways. By 2019, the tone becomes more explicitly regime-built. What changes in the language when a system moved from commentary to architecture? So you see more references to structure, oversight for token activity and service providers, and a clearer insistence that national measures alone are insufficient in a cross-border market. So why emphasize European coordination so strongly? Because it signals that the governance problem is not only domestic consumer risk, but supervision and enforcement across borders. So from 2020 through the transition period, the French tone becomes more procedural and European-oriented. Less debate about whether crypto belongs and more emphasis on how supervision should work in practice as harmonization approaches. So, and basically by 2025, the language reads like a mature supervisor, priorities, cross-border platforms, credibility, and enforcement posture. So this shift is not from anti-crypto to pro-crypto. It is from warning and distancing to design, accommodation, to normalize supervision. Germany's evolution is a little bit different. The more interesting question here is, did the tone actually change, or did the same governing style become more operational over time? Now, from 2018, BaFin speaks in a technology-neutral classification first register. Instead of treating crypto as exceptional, it asks, what is the activity? What risk does it create? And which legal category does it trigger? What does that to do in language? So it basically produces a technical tone early, less narrative about building a new pathway, more emphasis on how existing rules apply once classification is determined. So by 2019, the discourse becomes more explicitly legal operational. Prospectus expectations, authorization, triggers, and compliance implications. And in 2020, the tone hardens into supervised entry controls, especially around custody. But what kind of language dominates when market entry becomes the focal point? Authorization, conditions, governance requirements, internal control, compliance systems. In 2021, the tone expands into infrastructure. Why is that important? Because electronic securities and crypto securities recorded through supervised structure signal something more than containment. Tokenization is enabled, but only through formal legal architecture. So from 2022 onward, the language becomes more granular as new domain appears. How does Germany talk about decentralized finance? See, as a governance challenge where risks to consumers and market order matter, and to where regulation may become necessary if scale grows. How does it treat non-fungible tokens? Through case-by-case legal qualification and risk, rather than board labels. By 2024 and 25, the language, of course, converges into European implementation mechanisms, categories, disclosures, authorization, pathways, and supervisory allocation. The underlying style remains consistent. Define the perimeter through law, operationalize supervision through controls. So what is the comparative signal here? France's language visibly shifts from distancing to design and legitimization to transition management and mature supervision. Germany's language is more consistently technical, becoming increasingly detailed as the system moves from classification to authorization to infrastructure and then to European rulebook implementation. And the critical point of this is when authorities change their tone, they are not only changing rhetoric, they are signaling what the market should expect, who must comply first, and how adoption will actually be expected under supervision. Even though France and Germany converge under MiCA, does that mean the comparison no longer matters? Well, not really, because MiCA harmonizes the legal endpoint, tries to, not the way each system arrived there. And why does that pathway matter? Because it shaped what adoption meant in practice before harmonization. How quickly crypto was pulled into supervision, which activities were prioritized first, and what kinds of compliance expectations become normal early. Even after MiCA, who experiences regulation through the text alone? In reality, firms and consumers experience regulation through supervisory practice. How rules are interpreted, enforced, and prioritized. If we frame the comparison through the four processes that I mentioned earlier, the contrast remains consistent. So first we have the strategic processes, right? Strategically, what did each country optimize first? Innovation, protection, or perimeter control? France moved from early boundary-centered into design supervised pathway and then managed the transition into European Union harmonization, while Germany stayed more classification-led and anchored control through supervised entry and later formal infrastructure logic. From a consultative perspective, who was the message rely for and what was it trying to achieve? France relied on public-facing tools, warnings, initial coin offering, focused on engagement, and later decentralized finance agenda intended to shape and legitimize a pathway, whereas Germany signaled direction more through technical perimeter, classification, and authorization logic. Now, from a deliberative perspective, where did the real work of governance show up? Pathway design or legal engineering? So France focused on building and refining a national regime and aligning it with the European framework, while Germany focused on legal mechanical integration, authorization conditions, controls, and formal structures. So from an evaluative perspective, how did each system learn as the market evolved? France's feedback loop is most visible in tightening into transitioning and setting cross-border supervisory priorities. Germany, on the other hand, is visible in incremental perimeter expansion and increasing technical granularity as new forms emerge. So what is the key takeaway here? The destination is shared, yes, but the routes still share market restructure and regulatory experience. And if one European rulebook is the same on paper, why can the signals feel different in practice? Well, because institutional pathways leave legacies in sequencing, supervisory emphasis, and the compliance culture that markets adapt to. So that brings us to the end of today's episode. If you found this comparison useful, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with anyone working in regulation, compliance, policy, or digital assets. I would also love to hear from your perspective. Do you think a single European Union rulebook will gradually standardize supervisory practice, or will national regulatory styles continue to shape how compliance is experienced? You can leave a comment below, and if you want more episodes like this, country comparisons, regulatory timelines, policy process breakdowns, turn on notifications so you do not miss the next one. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next episode of By the Rules.